Welcome back to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. Very happy to be joined by the co-founders of a new platform called Mucktracker. We have Kate Dalton and Eliot Chayt as our guests on today's show. Kate and Eliot, Eliot and Kate, welcome to Trending in Education.
Hi, thank you. Happy to be here.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, it's great to have the two of you. And I may refer to the two of you as y'all, because that's my relatively okay collective second person pronoun. Yeah, something like that. So yeah, I'd love to get our listeners acquainted with what Mucktracker is and what you're trying to accomplish with it and where you are in your life cycle with the effort here around media literacy, news literacy, delivering that in a K-12 space primarily, but also applications in higher ed and lifelong learning and super zeitgeisty, as I like to say, zeitgeisty. It's super zeitgeisty heading into this election season. People need to understand what their news sources are. They need to develop their critical thinking. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with the two of you. But before we get started in the nuts and bolts of that, I'd love to hear each of you tell your origin story as someone who's at this point in the world of learning and education. So maybe we'll start with you, Kate, and then follow up with Eliot.
Sure. Yeah, I have a background as a K-12 educator. I taught high school English in Washington, D.C. and New York City for 7 years. Mm-hmm. I transitioned from that to write educational content for another EdTech company. Mm-hmm. And then in 2016, or shortly thereafter, I met Eliot Chayt through a citizens group, and we began working on Mucktracker, this online learning platform for students to critically evaluate and interact with the news.
Awesome.
And let's see. So I got my PhD in media studies from the University of Texas at Austin. Mm-hmm. And then in a strange turn of events, ended up working at Facebook in the editorial department in New York. And I kind of had a little bit of a revelation that even though I had spent at that point 10 years studying the media, I knew very little about how a lot of digital media was being produced and consumed. And it made me want to re-enter from the ground level, start over again with thinking about media literacy and media pedagogy.
Yeah.
And that's when I came up with the idea for Mucktracker. I had been playing around a little bit, but it wasn't really until I met Kate that we started to turn it into a real mission-driven project and decided to focus on educational space.
Awesome. Yeah, so I'd love to hear more about what Mucktracker is specifically. It's a product, it's something an educator can use to help deliver media literacy curriculum to their students in their classrooms. But I'd also love to understand more at the conceptual level, what is media literacy? What is the mission you were describing, Eliot? Maybe we could pick up with you there, and then Kate, add any color you think makes sense. But what's the problem space that you're wading into here, and then how does Mucktracker help start to drive towards a better place?
Yes, well, the topic of media literacy first of all, as a separate kind of literacy is baffling to me, because all literacy is media literacy. And just because traditionally we think of literacy as associated with things like books, a book is a particular medium, right? And communication form. But as there are increasingly things moving into information moving into new media, and I think everyone is unmoored by a lack of common literacy standards around these collective media that we use, many of which are digital and online area, when really what we're talking about these days is literacy.
Right.
Because media literacy is based on the idea that in order to understand the mass media, you have to have a separate set of tools than generally understanding literature and communication. But right, what we're really talking about is understanding a literacy, how to understand and interpret communication mediums that is all inclusive. So that's the first. That's the first part of media literacy.
And just jumping in on that too, the Marshall McLuhan quote, "The medium is the message." these different media formats, the profusion of them makes the ways in which we can receive information really varied, and the numbers of sources that may or may not be validated in the used to be like a higher barrier to entry to be in the quote unquote media, but with that higher barrier came a little more rigor and some standards and some sense of accountability. Now that everybody can be a publisher, it makes the world a much more confusing place. And even these types of insights are not typically in K-12 education. They're not built into the K-12 curriculum typically. And then even, not every university has a media studies program. And even then, the way those programs are defined is somewhat varied. So I'd love to hear more, though, about what the platform is and how it actually works. So Kate, maybe can you pick up with that a little bit?
Sure. The platform is providing a way for students to engage with different media sources, hopefully in a way that's different than how they encounter them in their daily lives. Mm-hmm. So we want to both mirror their daily lives, but also challenge it a bit to get them thinking about how they consume the media and how the media produces messages that are delivered to them. So students can interact with the news, they can search the news, they can annotate sources, they can save them to collections, they can manipulate and organize them to make meaning of the sources, depending on what the teacher wants them to look at. So they could be looking at sources that have a certain bias, and they could be moving them into different sections on a Canvas space. Or they could be looking at sources just to organize them for their research paper, right? Sometimes they need help doing that because there's just so many sources there, right?
Yeah.
And then there's also this idea that we're going to use visualization, like a horizontal timeline, for them to have a sense of agenda setting or framing, what's being covered, what's not being covered, and the how and the why.
Right.
To consider these patterns in news coverage and really the bigger picture of it all, to have that to be able to step back and reflect on what the message is or what the messages are.
Yeah. And for you as someone who's been a K-12 educator, you've taught high school, one of the things we're trying to understand is what's it like to be a K-12 educator these days, and what types of things do you need to be effective. From that experience for you, Mucktracker, how would you use it? How would you bring it into your classroom? How would you bring it to life?
Yeah, and just speaking from my own experience, I taught mainly upper grades in high school. So a big part of that task was, one, teaching students to write research papers, sometimes as a graduation requirement, often for the first time. And that was a huge task, and to help them do it and to be able to track their process throughout. And so Mucktracker would provide a way for me to be able to see the sources they're thinking through, how they're thinking about it, what they're deeming good and bad, or, just confused about. So I'd have a chance to check on that. And then also with the standards of all the nonfiction standards, or the standards related to AP English Language and Composition, which I also taught for several years, and to examine rhetoric and that issue of framing again, and what these little language choices, what's the difference between using the word lie or misstatement, right? That's like a big thing that you have to teach your kids, and to be able to put it in the context of the news where the stakes are high and important, establishes that relevance and gives them some more added context.
Yeah, that's where I was going next, was the relevance side, because we've had a lot of conversations of late about if a student doesn't know why they're learning something, it's a lot more likely that they'll check out. And that's why a lot of the conversations have had, despite the real turmoil and difficulty that we're facing in the right now, the idea that you can activate the learning curiosity in your students nowadays because the news is so relevant, and then being able to flow that through a platform that's designed to teach media literacy, I think that's a real opportunity. And yeah, Eliot, I'd love to hear more from you on all this.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we want to push in this focus on journalism as part of the media ecosystem, right? Not only the point that you made earlier about how the open access has created lots of voices within this system, but that as the teacher and the student and the producers of the content and the amateurs and everyone is involved in a process all together, right? And we're all at different places there, but it really removes the barrier because we're all trying to understand what's being said. And I think that there's a place for the student to learn and also for the teacher to learn, right, aspects because the technology is changing so rapidly.
Yeah,
especially.
I think that's a really important point, and I made a similar point recently, is that the fact that we're all going through this shared experience of quarantining at home, sheltering at home, spending a lot more time online. Obviously, some folks may have more challenges even to have more time online. So that's just a separate issue. But the idea that it's easier for us to empathize with others and come at it more on a level playing field, allow it to be a little more emergent rather than top down, and for the educator to be like a co-creator of an experience that everyone learns from, is sort of the broader platform angle that I think is really interesting in terms of what you're doing, because I think it applies to K-12, but I think it does apply really throughout our lives. We need to learn how to be critical about what's emerging, and frequently you learn the most by being in a diverse group with different perspectives. And in some ways, then the K-12 educator is bringing her own perspective to the conversation with some rules and guardrails. And I imagine some of the guardrails are probably built into the platform. So what's next? Right now, you're relatively early stage. You've gotten some funding. You're getting some more awareness. You're building the product. You're planning to launch sometime this fall, when everyone's really trying to understand what's true and what's the news.
I think for us in the fall, we're looking to, in the interim while we're developing the platform, getting it ready to go for that release, the launch, we're going to be providing lessons and content for teachers to provide to students, and for them to engage with the media and critically examine them as it pertains to these big social issues about Black Lives Matter, civil unrest, the election that's coming up, COVID-19. We're looking to pull in our resources and have some inquiry-based activities for them to do without our technology, but using the technology that they have right in front of them, but applying the core curricular concepts.
Awesome. And then, so if educators or listeners want to learn more about that, they would go to mucktracker.com.
Correct.
That's right.
Yeah, got it. And then if things go well, where do you see this going? So you're still relatively early in the conversation. You know, folks, I think, are activated by some of the ideas and the direction. How big could this go? What are some ways in which it might make an impact? I'd love to get maybe, Eliot, some of your perspective on that.
Sure. Well, I'm generally kind of concerned with the way that the media and education intersect, the ways that media and education intersect. And so one of the ideas behind the product was that this would be a way to make sure that current events were being given their full due in classroom settings, and that the media, as it has become, right, is also being examined and explored. You know, in the past, it was, you know, it would be, students would have news digests or something like that, but there would there was always a version of the news for educational purposes.
Right.
And right now, I think we need that, but we also need a version that respects the student's ability to, right, kind of go out into the real world of news and see the messages that are being targeted to them.
Right. And to that end, how much can you include things like YouTube or social media, places where Gen Z is notoriously spending a lot of their time? There's more mature, you know, validated news agencies, formerly print, now web-based mainly. But what about other forms of like video or audio media? Is that stuff that can be consumed into the platform, or that can be part of the curriculum that you're teaching?
Well, it's certainly part of the curriculum. I mean, the idea is that everything is an example, right?
Okay.
Right now, what we're pulling in is basically text from web pages.
Right.
But there's, you know, there is certainly the potential, and people have been doing a lot. You know, everything is getting easier all the time. Maybe not licensing, although that's getting easier too.
Sure. And also, I've talked frequently about how audio and text are in many ways the same, becoming the same format. You know, like you can quickly through speech to text convert just about any audio into text.
Yes.
And so if you had a transcript of a
Transcripts.
podcast, for example, that could be used. Because another thing we have had conversations with educators who are having good success using emerging media formats in their lesson plans for that same relevance point that you were making earlier, Kate.
Yeah, and I think we are designing the platform in a way that we have a notion of text that is broad, that whatever goes in there could be a print text, it could be a non-print text, it could be a non-news text, right? It could be, we have this, that basic core unit that could function in a variety of ways as we progress.
Right. Awesome.
The unit can be annotated, it can be tagged, and it can be connected to any other unit within the database.
Cool.
So, it's a way of one of the biggest just issues that I have in teaching is that students they'll Google something, they'll pick the first result, they don't know where they found it, right? They don't keep track, they don't save. So a big part of what we're doing is just creating this scaffolding space, a space for students to engage in research in a intentional way.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's almost like a wall, like intentionally a wall garden that has some boundaries around it so you can control and understand what activity is happening in there, which does make sense. In some ways, it's almost like builds the virtual and cognitive classroom management into the platform experience so that folks can stay on task too, because that is another, in addition to tracking your sources, just once a curriculum moves online, it moves to all the distractions that are online.
Right.
If you can at least build an intentional space that folks who want to lean into the learning can focus, I imagine that's a really valuable thing. I did want to touch on just the name Mucktracker, which I think is pretty cool, and there's some history to tie to there. And then, we talked about, mucktracker.com is where people can go. If they want to opt into this, particularly as a K-12 educator, certainly you'll be interested in that. And then we'll conclude. I generally like to ask my guests, what other trends are you noticing in the world around you? Is there anything you want our listeners to be open to or paying extra attention to? So that's how we'll close. But prior to that, a little bit of history around Mucktracker and muckraking and muckety mucks. So I don't know, Eliot, are you in the best position to describe that, or is that Kate?
Do you want to give us a crack at it, Kate?
Sure. I think for us, it's about honoring that tradition of the muckrakers, the digging up the dirt, the investigative journalism, having that in our students that are our users, our teachers that are in our platform that have that kind of spirit and that like critical stance towards the world and the information in front of them. And so we want them to emulate them in our system. And then we also want to kind of honor that legacy of journalism from the past and honor it by challenging it in a way too, right? By being critical of the news media sometimes to uplift it as well.
Yeah, and if folks are interested in that history, it's Muckrakers, Ida B. Wells. There's a wealth of knowledge. I saw it on your website too. You do have some of the history there, which is a nice, if you do want to poke around and understand the history of investigative journalism and some of the ways in which folks who were in journalistic roles and media roles and news roles were critical agents in the evolution of American history. There's some really interesting stuff to dig into there. So
I'll just say Ida B. Wells got the honorary Pulitzer this year.
Yeah, right.
So that was long overdue. And it's also being part of this space and this work. It's nice to see other people that are doing the work related to Ida B. Wells and honoring her legacy as well in terms of journalism and critical data analysis online. So.
Yeah.
And also to connect to this feeling of civic responsibility that a lot of young people have, that the media is not just a landscape of consumerism, right? That there is a way in which journalistic tradition and the access to these platforms does really empower people as citizens and as voters.
Yeah, awesome. So a little bit of additional homework for those of you who did not know about the Muckrakers, Ida B. Wells, really interesting history there. Go to mucktracker.com. You can find out about that. You can opt into some pilots, get some more information. And then as we conclude, I'd love to get any parting thoughts from each of you. And with that, anything emerging trends, something new, something interesting that's kind of capturing your imagination. Maybe begin with you, Kate, and then conclude with you, Eliot, if that works.
Yeah, I mean, with a lot of the conversations around equity, especially around racial justice, but also socioeconomic justice, paying a lot of attention to asset-based learning and education, moving away from deficit-based. And we're trying to be intentional about that in our product, but it's also just really interesting to check out some of the conversations out there around asset-based learning, moving away from that deficit mindset, and really examining the ways we think about teaching and learning and the products we're building in that space.
Yeah, great stuff. Yeah, I no longer say achievement gap, I say opportunity gap. That just at a high level is one way in which I've noticed that change, but it's definitely asset-based learning is the term there. So folks, check that out. That's a nice one, Kate. And then Eliot, concluding thoughts?
Well, I'll just kind of agree with Kate in it because I think one of the things that, in particular, that kind of approach can bring to media literacy is that folks have varying exposure to different sources of media, but that exposure and that intelligence or knowledge is not something that's rewarded necessarily with traditional literacy education, right? If the idea is you shouldn't be reading this, you should be reading that, you shouldn't be looking at this, you should be looking at that. And so I think in this space particularly, with new media literacy, nothing is wasted, really. All knowledge it becomes in handy, and that's true for journalists as well.
Right. Yeah, everything's a learning opportunity these days, and it's changing so fast. We really need to take the time to reflect and be critical. In a lot of ways, that's kind of what media studies is about, and that's what it sounds like your platform has built many of these tools into the experience so that folks can develop that critical perspective, which can be learned, but it does take practice. So Eliot and Kate, co-founders of Mucktracker, mucktracker.com. Really fascinating conversation. Look forward to tracking your future success as you move into this really interesting space at this hugely relevant time. Thanks very much for joining us on Trending in Education.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, and for our listeners, if you liked what you're hearing, tell a friend, share on social, share on your LinkedIn, and follow us everywhere you can. We'll be back again soon. Thanks for listening to Trending in Education.